Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you are a returning subscriber, welcome. Hope you're having an amazing day. I'm so happy that you're here with us. You see what happens when you join and subscribe to the Ethics Experts? You get a bonus greeting on every single episode, so hit that subscribe button. I'm here with my favorite professor that I've never met before, Daniel Coffeen. How are you, Daniel?
I am quite well, thank you.
So to give you our listener a little background, I used to commute for a long time, every day, hours a day when I lived in Chicago, and this was when iTunes U kind of first came out. So you are like the most famous professor on iTunes U. You had this really cool course about rhetoric, which I loved. I actually listened to it a couple of times, and I actually wrote a paper that I was going to send you, and I got done with the paper, and I was like, what am I doing? This guy's going to think I'm a psychopath.
It's funny that whole experience actually changed my life pretty radically, right? Because it reoriented. It's funny because I work in the industry, right? I actually have another job, right, where I consult to tech and internet. I've had a bunch of startups, and I didn't really understand the power of the internet until that course would go live on iTunes U about 2 hours after I'd be, out of the classroom, and I'd get a flood of emails from people all over the world. People sent me all kinds of insane things every day. I mean, I still get emails about one a month.
How crazy!
So it wouldn't have been, you would have been in the mix.
But I would have been filed into whatever that trash bin that you use is. So like that was really kind of at the start of this whole podcast thing, and like that was really kind of early on in the game. What kind of prompted you to, like, how did that whole opportunity come up?
Oh, you know what? It had nothing to do with me. So I got approached by the university, not even my department. My department wasn't quite fond of me, so the first chance they had, they removed me from their channel. But yeah, that was from the tech department. Just because, the intro was a pretty popular class. It's a pretty big class, about 150 students. And so, that's what they were trying to target classes like that. And they just came to me. They're like, snap on the mic, and they made sure everything ran along. I was very impressed with the most competent tech people I've ever worked with. I've worked with a fair number of tech people. That team at UC Berkeley, they were so freaking on it. It was sort of fantastic.
Well, so I love that class. That had a really big effect on me and my life, and so many of the principles that you taught at that time, they just really, I kind of came up in the business world. I came up in accounting and finance, and so I never got to take any of those cool classes. And so I got to kind of, live out my, liberal arts wild days in the car in Chicago. And I just got exposed to so many cool things in this rhetoric class. It kind of went a different direction than what I thought, sort of what a sort of typical sort of logic and rhetoric discussion would be. My only exposure prior to that was Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. So I don't know if that's like a hack book or what, but
it's great. It's an incredible book. Yeah, it's awesome.
But in any case, so much of what you talked about, I see sort of all over the place in my life. And right now, the whole basis of this podcast is, the Ethics Experts. It's designed for ethics and compliance and HR people who are largely categorized as outcasts. I'm being dramatic. They're looked at as cost centers in their organizations, when in actuality, they are the purveyors or the arbiters of culture in many ways. And there's this huge opportunity, especially as we shift into this knowledge work economy, where the line between sort of the external brand and the internal brand, the employee experience and the client experience, that begins to meld, and the culture of the organization ends up feeding out into what the clients interact with. We are our work, all these different things, and there's just so much great overlap. And so I was really excited to get you on. I'm not trying to put you in a box. We're going to do sort of an eminent read here. But I'd love to talk a little bit about your book, talk a little bit about some of these sort of rhetorical principles that I think you're really great at talking about. And, in the context of this organizational culture thing, in the context of these codes of conduct that, our listeners are, kind of stewards of and so forth, and the disconnect that often happens between these words that are written in these documents, right? These really nice, shiny PDFs and all that stuff, and the actual experience that people are living out on a day-to-day basis in their companies.
Yeah. It's funny bringing this all up, because my work is actually brand strategy. And I often focus on the culture, right? It's like, we can't talk about external without talking about internal, the same thing, right? You can't, and so I've done some of that stuff, some of
Oh,
that reorg.
interesting. I didn't even know that. I just listened to you on repeat, and so I just think that you're just still a teacher from, a professor from back in the day. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. But yeah, I mean, there's a few things. One is companies are really funny because they love these big old principles. I was just having a conversation with a friend of mine who just started a company, and I was looking over their internal stuff, and it's like some of them are so funny, like when they're really high level, like respect. We respect each other. I mean, what are you talking about? What the heck does that mean?
Right.
And then you get the absurdity of the precise rules and regulations, right? So because I'm incorporated, but I'm just me, I can't work with a lot of big organizations because they don't know what to make of me. Right. And they're so afraid of compliance with labor laws that they just won't work with me. Or they require so much liability insurance, right? As if I'm a huge corporation, right? Even though I won't be on site, even though everything was virtual, even though, I mean, it literally just adherence to a rule as opposed to actually navigating the circumstance.
Yeah, and there's this like bizarre disconnect. Well, it's like, well, this rule is sort of etched in stone, and why can't you sort of fit into this box? There's not this, I don't know. We just kind of like live in this world of gray, and yet there's so many binary things that are sort of etched into stone, so to speak, in these laws and in these, bylaws or whatever you want to call them within the organization. And it ends up, my kind of ongoing theory is that there's no generation that's sort of more attuned to like inauthenticity than our generation, right? Like we see it all the time. We're bombarded with like all this media. I want to talk about your book, which I love, by the way. And I think a lot of this is, I mean, it's all kind of one thing we're talking about at some level, but that attunement to inauthenticity, to your point, what kind of, what do you see in your clients in terms of like their culture being, unresonant or disresonant, whatever the opposite of resonant is with this image that they're putting out, externally from a brand perspective?
Yeah. So they'll do funny things like, I mean, incentives are a huge thing. Do you incentivize a team? Do you incentivize an individual?
Right.
That already changes very much the culture. I mean, that's one of the hugest changes you can make. Right. Because someone's just working for themselves, trying to screw over everybody else, or if they all need to cooperate to get whatever kind of bonus structure or whatever kind of kudos they're going to get.
Right.
For the major ones, or then having departments compete against each other is one of the weirder ones, right? And that happens all the time. And I won't name names of some of these big clients of mine, but really strange things. Everyone's looking at their P&L and they're like fighting, but you work for the same company. So that's just a terrible structure,
Yeah, there's this otherism that sort of creeps into the organization, and they're fighting turf wars within the four walls of their garrison or whatever when the battle's going on in the marketplace outside of there.
Exactly. And it's completely insane. It's simply because they have this structure and they don't know how to change it. They don't know how to make, so people, and they tie incentives and livelihood to individuals, right? Which is so peculiar. So they're fighting with these other folks, not telling them certain things so they can put the product out and it can be on their P&L, or they're trying to put a loss off on a different department. It's so peculiar, right? And the companies up here, and they don't do anything to change it. I've never understood that. Like, why wouldn't you just make different laws? Why wouldn't you just structure this differently? It's not that difficult. Very strange to me.
Yeah, and especially because you can control all those laws in your company. It's not like it's not like we're subject to these list of sort of business laws that exist, other than sort of whatever's sort of taught across MBA schools or whatever. Like each company can be its own thing. It can have its own values and its own frameworks and so forth. But I love this idea about a code of conduct, because it's supposed to sort of be a recipe for how everybody is supposed to act. And yet these values on the wall, this is something that we talk about all the time. Every website has a values page and a mission page. And to your point, we all respect each other and it's all integrity. And I think most people think that it's an absolute joke, but as a result of that, like there's so much magic that can come from like actually shrinking that gap between these values and these walls on the page, this aspirational culture, and like what people are actually living out. In your, maybe give us a little background on what your sort of your main job is in terms of doing like brand consulting is, and maybe tell us a little bit about like where some of the tires are flattened in the organizations that you deal with in the context of this, brand or this sort of culture gap that it kind of exists.
Yeah. Well, one thing is every time I come in, almost every time I come in, the executive team is always super proud again of their offsite they did with their internal values, right? And they're parsing all these words, and they're like, "This is our brand." I'm like, "No, all you said was respect each other." I don't even know what that means, right? So one thing I try to push them always towards is just whenever I give them a big word, I'm like, "This is what it means. If we believe in respect, right, these things happen, right? You don't need to ask for permission. You don't need to, are you actually empowering people? Really, practically speaking, can somebody sign a contract? Can somebody, initiate a new project? Or do you really respect them?" And I think what happens is these companies just really love to hear themselves talk. And they really think they're making a big move, right? It sounds
I like that. Put that in bold. Put that in all caps. Yeah.
Exactly. And every time I'm always sort of disheartened when they're so proud and show it to me. I'm like, yeah, this isn't anything. Sorry, this is literally nothing. You've done nothing. Let me sort of begin from scratch.
So I want to tie this back to your book a little bit. So you just wrote this book. Well, when did it come out? It came out this year, right?
No, 2016.
2016, really?
Yeah.
Well, it just came into my bookshelf this year. I had no idea. Anyways, it's called Reading the Way of Things Toward a New Technology of Making Sense. And I'm going to butcher this. So please, I brought you on here so that you can correct me and educate me. But the main point, I think, of this book is these two types of ways that we read things, right? There's this imminent reading and, the other type. Exemplary reading, right. So exemplary is sort of the base reading. The imminent reading is sort of letting the thing speak for itself, so to speak. And maybe can you explain these concepts a little bit more? Because I think there's that kind of dynamic occurring in the context of these values that we put on the wall versus what people are eminently sort of like living out as they read the air or read the room in their organizations,
That's exactly right. So you have what people say, and then you have the performance of what's actually happening.
Exactly. Yeah.
So exemplary reading is generally, of course, how we read everything, right? So everything is a sign for something else.
Right.
Right. So we say this book is an example of postmodern literature. This movie is an example of an action movie. Right? And we do it with art all the time. And we do everything except look at the art itself, right? So I know in the book I talk about the little placard on the wall next to the painting. Everyone goes into the museum and then they look down at the placard and they'll get certain information that has nothing to do with the painting. You'll know the person who painted it, but how does that affect your experience with the painting? You'll know the year. How does that affect your experience with the painting, the materials? Maybe there's a little blurb about the movement or that he knew this person. It's all historical. It's all everything but actually looking at the painting.
Right.
And so what that does is deprivilege the experience of looking at something. It says, no, those are experts who know things, and those things are general and provable and codified. Right. And so it just plugs in. So you take the wildness of a painting, the wildness of a Picasso painting, and then it gets grouped. It says, no, this is an example of Cubism. This is from 1943. This is right. They want to remove the sort of again, the wildness, the exuberance, the actual event experience of that painting.
Right. They try to drop these silos on it and say, this is what this is, when to your point, a child could look at that and not even be able to read, and they're going to have their own sort of interpretation of it. And it's so much more pure. I love that word exuberance because it's so like unbounded, right? It's just, you're kind of in it. You're in it in that moment of sort of where sort of time is suspended and sort of reality suspended. You're just sort of absorbed into it in this like sort of weird sort of ether.
Yeah, it becomes a kind of, you come entwined with it, right? The sort of feedback between you and it. And you have whatever knowledge you have, right? So some people might come there as art historians or, they art collectors, and they'll have an opinion based on that stuff. And it's not really an opinion about whether it's good or bad, but they'll have an experience.
Right.
They'll see it in relationship to others. Someone will come and say, I know nothing about art history. I've never seen a painting. And they'll bring whatever they know from their lives to it. Right.
But isn't it interesting? Like if you bring, again, broad brushstroke, a country bumpkin who's never been to a modern art museum before, they don't know any of that stuff. And you bring them in and they see an art installation that is 30 feet on the wall of a red yarn that just drops at a right angle into a pile on the floor. And they're like, that's stupid. And then you say, no, that's not stupid because he was doing this and he was doing that. And it's not stupid only when it's sort of propped up with all this other sort of context and things that are happening outside of that actual installation.
Yeah. Or there is an experience. So the thing you just described sounds fantastic to me, right? So imagine that bumpkin coming in. He thinks he's trying to look at something great.
Okay.
In fact, what we should be teaching is not this exemplary. Don't look for the great thing. Come in with what I call imminent reading and experience the thing. Stand in front of it. Look at the scale of it. What does that red line do for you? You might still say, it does nothing for me.
Right. So
Right.
I saw that thing before and I did love it, but I saw other people at it like being like, this is so stupid, because to your point, I guess there was something that they were trying to fill in, some sketch they were trying to fill in.
Like, what does this represent? What does this mean? Those are not the right questions. The question is, what does it do for you? What does it do for you? And sometimes that means, one thing I quote in there is that, the beginner's mind, right? Which is this whole Buddhist principle, right? That you're always sort of beginning again. You come in without the knowledge, right? You don't try to fix it in place. You just sort of open. So you come into that space, you're in that museum space, which is already kind of strange and kind of beautiful, right? And it's very church-like on purpose, right? And you try to negotiate it, right? And one thing, like I hate museums when they're crowded because I can't get in that space.
Yeah.
It's not just seeing the thing. I want to be immersed in that thing, right? So, which is often hard, in like big tourist sites, right? Because it's really crowded. You're trying to look at this wall with this, this thin red line. There's a lot of people in the way. It's hard to read it.
Do you feel like, I mean? Yeah, I do. I know exactly what you mean because then you're getting sort of distracted by these other people around you. And at least when I've been in situations like that, it's like, well, I don't want to look like a weirdo, or I don't want to take up too much space here, or take up too much time, or be selfish with my, you know what I'm saying? So there's all these other stimuli that kind of derail you from that.
The trick is to learn to overcome that. I'm in museums. I get told constantly. I've been kicked out of museums by they get too close to them. There was a big Calder exhibit at SF MoMA, which is all these mobiles, right, hanging everywhere. They're incredible. And the museum wasn't big enough at the time, so it was a little claustrophobic, but I wanted them to move. So I was fanning them and blowing them. Yeah, every time I got kicked out, right? They're like, no, you can't touch them. I'm like, well, they're mobiles.
They're meant to do that, aren't they?
They move.
Shut the window.
They're mobile.
But I mean, it's such an interesting distinction, and it's interesting that you had to call imminent reading a new technology, because it's almost like, I don't know why. I don't know if it's just from, hey, we're just so educated and, we're reading all the time, or we're being told how to look at things so much that sort of our go-to reading, so to speak, is our exemplary reading. And so like this new technology is really just a de-evolution back to like what's maybe more raw, like that more beginner's mind, as you said, or something. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know if it's as I like it as a technology. It's just two different ways of making sense, because the exemplary mode does work, right? You do learn something. It does create a knowledge. In fact, that is the entire knowledge base, right, of the West, right? It's about categories, genus and species, and this is a mammal, and right, and it builds this whole elaborate edifice, right? But there's another technology, right? You can come to something and plug it in, no question about it. This is an example of capitalism. This is an example of the Oedipal complex. This is an example of patriarchy or feminism. That's why everything's taught in schools, and it's not inherently bad, right? But what it does is it privileges these other things, and usually what it does is privilege the expert, right? It privileges hierarchy and the expert, right? Which of course is in the interest of the ruling class, right? And it comes, from the state, from the church, right? You have to know, you can only know God through the priest,
right?
You can't have this direct knowledge. And that of course has been like Luther and all these people kind of went nuts and said, no. We can have this direct relationship to God. We don't need this structure. Now imagine that coming in education or art experience, right? I don't need to have access to the art expert to enjoy and know and experience Picasso. Right? There's another technology there that's imminent where I can follow it, and it involves a different relationship to concepts, a different relationship to categories. It's not that there's no categories anymore. It's that the categories emerge from the painting out rather than from out to the painting. So I can look at a Picasso, and rather than place him in this historical period, right, or to these known categories, I can say, wow, this one is really like this weird Egyptian thing.
Right.
That's 2,000 years old. And that's like the song I love. And the three of them create a kind of movement, a concept, a category, right? Maybe I'll call it like the name of my company. And the name of my company came out of this concept that I created by looking at the art I love called joyful complexity, right? I wanted art that whether it was music, writing, visual art, film, I wanted the concept grouped these things that were really affirmative and really convoluted. It had a tremendous complexity, like Escher, like Borges, like Joyce, right? The spiral kind of out, but are affirming the world.
Yeah. I love that. I love that sort of etymology of the name, because it also sort of speaks to likely what you're able to bring into an organization as a consultant, right? Like, you don't know all that history that's in place. You don't know all these conversations that have happened in this sort of, I don't know, the context that's in, you can just sort of come in and look at it fresh and say, like, well, what does respect mean? And they're like, well, I mean, we got Chipotle in, we had a 2-day offsite. This is the word, right? Like, you can flip it on its head with those fresh eyes. And I think like what's kind of interesting is, you said that this is kind of, this exemplary reading. So, okay, you kind of opened my mind that, one's not good and one's not bad. Again, how bizarre that I'd bring sort of exemplary reading to this whole concept in a sense, right? To categorize it. But for things like art, like academia, whatever, there's this sort of bias toward the exemplary reading kind of side of the equation. But then, like, in terms of like in our organizations, like on your first day, they try to bombard you with all this sort of exemplary stuff to say, we are this type of organization and this is what we value and all this other stuff, when people sort of default to their eminent reading of that organization in the sense that, like, well, are we really, like, do I see representation of my people on throughout the organ? You know what I'm saying?
I know exactly what you're saying. Yeah. I mean, that's, the concept that really set me off, that everything is sort of premised on is the performative.
Yes.
Right. That everything says something and then everything does something. Every word, everything in the world, right, makes certain declarations about itself. But we know that those things aren't necessarily the way it is. Right. And it's all the premise of psychoanalysis, right? You think something's happening, but it's something else. You're really angry at your mother, or, something traumatic happened. And that's the performance of what you're feeling, right? What are you doing? So what's actually happening? So in an organization, it's like, what are people doing? Right. And can we begin to create principles, maybe not rules, but principles, right, that emerge from the behavior that we see here that's kind of good, right? And the behavior that we see that we don't like, can we disincentivize that, right? And it comes down to very practical pathways, right? So that the rules and the incentive set and the org structure has to match and be in sync with what's actually happening, the actual behavior, the way people are interacting.
So that's a super interesting point. So I want to dive into that, but let's sort of zoom out and let's talk about, like, what do we mean by the performative? Because I had never heard that term, and now it's like I look at so much stuff in that light now.
Yeah, got it. It opened up my whole world, right? So the phrase comes from this philosopher, John Austin, J.L. Austin, with his series of lectures he gave. It all got into this book, the title of which is so fantastic, right? It's called How to Do Things with Words. I highly recommend it. It's super readable. There's no philosophical jargon and all that stuff. That was part of his whole thing, everyday language. But he says, there are certain words, right, such as I bet you. I bet you the Giants are going to beat the Pirates, right? In the very act of saying, I bet you, I am in fact betting you. Right. I'm not describing the act of betting you. Right? Same with christening a ship, same with getting married. When you're up at the altar and you say, I do, you're not describing getting married. In the very act of saying it, you are doing it, right? Christening a ship, you're actually christening the ship. And he says, well, he calls those explicit performatives, but he says, all words are performative. Every time you describe something, you're also doing something, right? And so one example, it can take something really banal, like, oh, it's sunny out. Okay, you told me a fact, it's sunny out. But what was performed in that? Why was I telling this? What's the effect on you of saying this? And why was I saying it? What's the context of it? It never comes out of nowhere. I could say, hey, it's sunny out, meaning let's go do something. And that means I'm situating our whole dynamic that maybe we don't do enough things together outside in the sun. Right. It's not just a simple declaration. We know this about any romantic relationship, friendship relationship, right? All the things we say are all actually reorganizing the social dynamic, right? And you're judging people and you're not judging people and you're trying to situate yourself within this whole group. Always, there's no neutral claim to anything. It always does something.
Yeah, and so, with my wife when she says I'm fine, that could mean 20 different things depending on, I mean, it's kind of that thing, that inflection, the words are just a means, the words are just a sort of a stage for whatever performance we're talking about, or whatever sort of 3-dimensional or 5-dimensional, whatever information needs to get conveyed beyond the 2-dimensional, sort of words on the page or something.
Yeah, exactly. And it's inevitable. There's no way around. It's not a bad thing. That's just the way, and there's all kinds of relationships between what the person says and the performance of it, right? So there's the passive aggressive, I'm fine, right? There's the encouraging, I'm fine. Right. There's a million ways, right? It's sarcasm, irony, and passive aggression, right? Are 3 really obvious things. And when there's a sort of a gap between what was said and the performance of what's happening. But there's always some performance. It's always doing something, right? There's no neutral word. It's impossible.
And something that's kind of related to that, which I was really struck by as I, read more of your stuff and listened to your classes and stuff, is like, there would be a band that I just couldn't stand. And then I would see the freaking VH1 Behind the Music or something, and I'd be like, oh, I like them now. It's like, well, how do I like them now? My only sort of basis for a legit, is their performance. Or, the other side of it is like, my wife can't stand Tom Cruise. So she can't watch a movie with Tom Cruise. Well, he's acting as a character in a particular movie. That difficulty of separating from the performance and like the person doing the performance is another interesting sort of piece of this puzzle. You know what I'm saying?
No, absolutely. But let's say I like the VH1 example because I've had the same experience plenty of times, right? Where they become endearing, kind of,
yeah,
right? Or there's something about them, they're hardworking, and you look at that song, but that's also part of the experience. That is an experience too. That's part of the 30-minute reading. It's not about a pure experience of the art. It's the way the art mixes and participates in the environment from sort of the inside out, and you kind of build this collage. So rather than saying, I love them purely, or I love them because they're heavy metal, or whatever the genre. Like, no. I like this piece and this piece and this thing kind of is silly, but because they're doing this over here that I learned, you just expanded your understanding of them, your experience of them, right? So now you have the song plus the VH1 documentary, right?
Yeah.
So now you have both experiences of them.
Yeah, you can see what's kind of going on outside of the sort of confines of the canvas or something. Because that performance, to your point, can be the canvas.
It's another canvas. It's another canvas.
Exactly.
When you watch, right? So everything sort of is more like a web, right? And it connects to things in these weird ways. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that it connects to biography or to art history, it's not a bad thing. But you began somewhere differently and you didn't prioritize and say, no, what only matters is that this is an example of this kind of music, or this is an example of this kind of art. You're like, no, that's part of it if you know that, if that's part of your experience, but it doesn't determine it, right? This comes up a lot when I was teaching this great essay by Roland Barthes called The Death of the Author. Students would get so upset, right? So he says, the argument is that author, of course, comes from the word authority, right? And the idea is if the author says the book is about, this book is really about America during World War II and everything we went through, that's what it's about. Well, no, I'm reading something totally different, right? Who cares what the author says? The author actually has no authority over the text. He's just another text.
Interesting.
Right? So everything's a text. So you have the text he wrote, you have the text of everything he says, the text of who that person is. That can be part of this text or not. You can know about the author or not know about the author.
So that's an interesting thing because, sometimes a movie will come out and like the director never talks about what it's about. And then you have all these people sort of writing about it. And I had sort of in the past been like, well, what do you know what it's about? Whatever he intended or she intended for it to be, that's what it's about. But what you just said is kind of a leveling of the playing field because it's kind of about all those things. And it can be about all those things sort of simultaneously or something.
And the fact is intention is just this weird thing. I can say, well, I intended to be nice. I'm sorry I hit you. I intended to be nice. So was I nice?
Yeah, right.
No, I hit you. It's the performance that matters, right? So the director could say, I meant to make a movie about America during World War II. But in fact, what you made is a movie about, the struggles of men and women in poverty or something, whatever.
Right.
Or you did this other thing. Who cares what you intended to do? We know this from psychoanalysis, right? That the thing you say is different from the thing you do. right? And your understanding of something. And just because you created the thing doesn't mean you have a better understanding of it. In fact, that's what a psychoanalyst says. No, I'll understand you better. And that's what a critic, right? Like an artist, you know, I taught at a art school here in San Francisco, and there were MFAs, right? So they're practicing artists. And it would be silly for them to critique their own work, right? Because that's not their job. That's my job. They're not good at critique. They're good at making art. I don't make art. I make this other kind of art, which is critique, right?
Got it.
They make the thing. And I would never make them write papers because that's not their thing. They've never been taught that. That's not an inherent thing we just know how to do. It's an art to be a good critic. It's an art and a practice to be a good imminent reader of things.
So I'd like to kind of double click on that thing,
Yeah.
because as an artist, you put so much of yourself into your work. So, and I'm going to draw this parallel to, like, in our knowledge work economy, we're not people just sort of stamping out metal anymore. We are our work and so forth. And there is, I think the application of this word critique, or this sort of intimacy that comes with critique over in the art world, there's probably a lot we can learn from that from like a management perspective when we are critiquing, managing, giving performance reviews to people within the organization. Because, again, they're not being artistic with their spreadsheets, but there's a certain level of their essence being put into that thing in a similar way. So, like, what did you learn in terms of becoming, you know, good at that form of imminent reading in terms of a critique that you think we could pull over into this sort of, you know, four walls of an organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, business is so obsessed with metrics, with quantification.
Right.
Everything's about quantification, right? And they think that makes everything fair. That's the idea. Well, it's fair, right? This person got the bonus because they hit this number, and this person doesn't get the bonus because they hit this number. But if you go and look at the experience and talk to them and figure out what the kinds of things they're doing, right? And the other kinds of effects that maybe they're having in the organization. How do we incentivize those? How do we reward those? How do we reward the person who keeps morale up, even though their sales are down, versus the guy whose sales are up, but he really is making people quit, right? Or annoyed, or less productive,
right.
Or just forget even less productive, forget the quantifiable numbers. These just makes people upset. And that in and of itself should be a problem, but there's no way to quantify it. So it's ignored.
Yeah, it doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist. Right. And so you miss a lot of the behavior and a lot of the potential passions and problems of people who are working with you, for you, you know, because you're just reading them, especially as a company scales, right? And it's not so intimate anymore. You don't really know them. And what can you go by? Well, you look at their numbers. Did they meet these numbers? Did they, you know, and that's this endless will to quantification that is really finally destructive, right? Because it's premised as being fair because it's numbers, but it's actually incredibly unfair, right? Because they're privileging certain things and not other things.
Yeah, you're privileging quantifiable things when there's a thousand other things that are unquantifiable or ethereal or subjective or whatever that then just don't exist in the context of this two-dimensional spreadsheet or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. You know, and that's, you know, I know companies love the performance review. I almost never worked for anybody, but I was at an agency for a very brief period, and they had performance reviews. I'd never seen anything like that before, right? I have somebody who I didn't necessarily respect talking about the work I did, and the whole thing was just so out of whack, because all they were looking at were the deliverables, right? And they weren't looking at the rest of everything that was happening. Right. And so I suddenly am denied a bonus or get a bonus. And it seems so arbitrary, but they think it's the opposite of arbitrary.
Fair.
Yeah, it's so fair.
Right.
And I'm like, no, this is arbitrary. You're just ignoring some things and not other things. You know.
So how did you take that experience and make sure that your critiques of these Masters of Fine Arts students when you were teaching over in that school didn't incorporate some of that dehumanization from that sort of corporate experience? You know what I mean?
Yeah. One thing I did is I didn't make them write. which means that I didn't make them perform something they didn't really know how to do. That the university had mandated they do, because writing is considered just not something you really need to teach, or critique is not something you really need to teach. They should just know how to do this. They made the art, they should know how to do it, right? And they have to write X number of pages, right, in order to get their degree. And I just ignored that. I was like, no, this is absolute waste of time here. right? Having these art students write these papers, they don't know how to write. I don't have the time to teach them how to write. They never had a course on it. It's not just an inherent thing that people know how to do.
Right.
It's something you learn how to do. It's a technology. You got to learn how to do it, how to use it, right? But it comes in as this unquestioned thing. If you made the art, you know what it means. You know how to talk about it.
Yeah, and it should take 4 pages or like some arbitrary number of pages or words.
Exactly. Yeah, same at Berkeley. Actually, when I taught at Cal for a long time, and I taught in the composition program for a long time, and I love teaching comp. But there's supposed to be a certain number of pages they're supposed to write, like 35 pages, which is a tremendous amount. And at some point, and in the beginning, I followed all that, and then as time went on, I was like, my God, it's so much easier for me to teach a student how to write by assigning a 1-page paper than by assigning a 10-page paper. Right? 10 pages, they get lost. They can't figure out what's going on. But if I just limit it to 1 page, 2 pages, right? I can see the argument right in front of me. And that's the art. The art is, how do I construct an argument? How do I have something to say about this art, about this text, about something? How do I not just list a whole lot of things about it, but create an argument? This thing participates in the world this way, right? And that's what's difficult. It's nothing to do with length. It has nothing to do with quantity. Right. In fact, the shorter and shorter I made it, the more effective it was in them learning how to build an argument. Today, if I were still teaching, I would use Twitter. I'd say, no, you got to be really concise. Just get to the point and tell me what your argument is. You have 280 characters.
Isn't that interesting? Right?
Just say, it's a great, I love Twitter for that reason. I think it's like an art project in and of itself. It gives these constraints around how you write, but it could become an incredible educational tool.
Yeah, and it's character limit. It's not word limit or something. So like you literally have a stamp. You got to write it on a stamp, basically.
Yep.
And it forces you to distill. And to your point, I mean, people make full arguments. I'm not talking about the nested Twitters because that's essentially a blog sometimes, but you can make a full argument in that little space.
That's why I'm attracted to it. And it also forces you to think about your grammar and your construction, right? English has rules, but you can begin a sentence all kinds of different ways. And if you begin a certain way, because of grammar, you'll have to end sort of a certain way.
Right.
Because you only have so many characters, you also want it to kind of land, right? It's not like this long paper where you sort of forget about the middle. You see the beginning, middle, and end right in front of you. It's only 280 characters.
Right.
So working on having it land, right? You end with a punch, you end with something, right? And so that means, well, how do I begin? And how do I say everything I need to say? Right. So just the very act of tweeting teaches you a ton about writing, about argument creation, right? About grammar.
You said something, how does this land? And so in that, I think perhaps from your background or just the way you're wired or whatever, there's this inherent connection. This is going to sound profound, but it's not, between like rhetoric, argument, and like ultimately persuasion. So how do those things work together, and how can we learn what that, sort of rhetorical triangle or that argumentation triangle, how can we pull from that and help elevate these functions that really have so much value to add to their organizations? Like just, you've probably met these people, the HR people, the ethics people, they have a heart in their chest, they have a brain in their head, they're smart people who care. It's like their like wings are clipped or something, and they don't speak the dollars and cents language that the board is just care, they just care about the bottom line. So I just see, I see in this decade as the generational shift occurs where, by the end of the decade, there's going to be 75% of the workforce are going to be millennials and Gen Zs who are wired a little bit different, who care about some of these intangible things, not just the bottom line. They care about the ESG thing and the social impact and all that kind of stuff. There's this opportunity, and we're kind of at this inflection point within our organizations where these folks can really, unclip their wings and start really flying. But it's either going to take time until, Gen Zs and millennials are running the companies and they're like, yeah, I get what you're saying, here's your budget. Or it's going to take turning on those light bulbs at the top for those people who are wired the different way, who are looking at, fairness in terms of just, quantitative metrics or whatever. So let's deconstruct maybe a little bit around rhetoric or argumentation on how they can try to land arguments better to turn those light bulbs on at the top and sort of like accelerate that ascension.
Yeah. Well, geez.
So go.
Well, I think HR people are often like teachers, right? They're not really taught. They're constrained by these syllabi, right? Or by these rules. And that's not why they got into it, right? They love math. They love organizations. I love working with people and helping an organization really help the people, right? Not just be productive for the company, but be good people, have a good working environment, a place people want to come
right.
and do their jobs, but then they get limited by these constraints, right? Just like a teacher, I got to teach the syllabus, even though the syllabus is ridiculous, So I think it's going to involve a whole lot of retraining, right? And I think the very notion of HR needs to be able to reflect that, right? And what sort of qualitative aspects, right, can we bring into play, right? So you bring up the rhetorical triangle, right? Which I assume you're talking about, like ethos, pathos, logos.
Yeah.
Right. And that comes back to the performative, right? So every argument, just, as a quick aside, when I'm doing a brand strategy, I use that triangle, right?
Okay.
I use pathos, logos. Yeah. I'm like, okay, who are you? Right, that's ethos. Who are you? How do you stand towards the world? What's your posture? With what authority do you participate? Do you tell me these things, right? And it can be, I'm your buddy, or I'm an expert, or I have a lot of experience, or I'm learning it along with you, right? These are different kinds of
postures or something. Yeah.
Exactly. And then there's logos. What do you mean? That's literally, what do you say? What's the logic of what you said, right? It's the actual word said. And then there's pathos, which is sentiment, right? Feeling. And everything ever said involves all three of those things necessarily, right? I say anything to you, right? I'm taking a posture. I'm saying something presumably logical, or trying to be logical. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole mood. There's a pathos, there's a sentiment, right, that runs through all that, right? And it's only when you bring those things together that you can make good sense of things, productive, interesting sense of things. If you just focus on the logos, what they said, what they did, you're missing everything else, right? So when let's say you're assessing your workforce, you're assessing an employee, right? I mean, think about their posture. How do they stand towards the company? Right? And towards everybody else in there? Are they the kind of expert? I mean, when I'm doing, I do these workshops for executive teams, and we're doing brand strategy, they always say, who should be in there? I'm like, well, who in your organization is really influential? And I don't care about their title, right? You got to just be honest with me. Who's throwing weight around? Who's going to kill something? Who's going to shit on it? Who's going to celebrate it? Who's going to be, I want that person in the room so I can get their buy-in, even if they're against it. Right. I want to try to win them over and have them participate in this thing. And it's nothing to do with title.
Totally.
And it's always this great moment, and they have to think about it. Right. And they're going through in their head who in their organization, and forget about their title. They might be really low down.
Right.
But they have enormous influence throughout the rest of the company. Right. And that's their ethos. Right. That's how they stand towards everybody else. Right. And their posture. It doesn't matter what their title is. Right. They have this influence based on who they are and how they interact. And the same with the pathos. We take into consideration sentiment, right? So this person gets their work done, but I really don't want to work with them. They're sort of unpleasant, right? They're always sad, or they're always angry, or they're always, critical, or they're, how do you assess that, right? But making that part of the vocabulary, I don't know how you do it, right? That's what you do for a living, But I think beginning to introduce those things, but then you have to have the people in HR know how to participate in that, right? How to think about that, how to make sense of that, and then how to still keep it kind of fair, right? Because you don't want them saying, and that's what's nice about the quantifiable stuff, right? It's not on them. The numbers, no one's responsible. The numbers speak for themselves, right? So everyone sort of abdicates responsibility, right? And once you start talking about these other things, well, then it becomes a particular person might get a bonus because I think they're nice, because I think they make the workplace better. Does that sound fair? I think it does sound fair, but you can see why someone would say, well, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound like you think that person's nice. I think that other guy is. Right. And so once you start leaning into these qualitative assessments, I see how tricky and messy it can get, but I think it's worth it, right? I think it's worth the time and energy to sort of teach this sort of the ability, right, to navigate, articulate pathos, sentiment.
Yeah.
Right. Well, it plays in an organization.
Yeah, because all those people that you're talking to are people, and we all communicate with those three sort of facets of this triangle, whether we articulate it in our mind or not. All those are different tuning forks that can resonate. You know what I'm saying? And many times, at least what I've seen is the perfect picture, I think, is when, the ethics and compliance person gets that 5 minutes at the end of the quarterly board meeting and they get up there and they're reading a bunch of numbers from a page. And, I don't want to say that it's devoid of pathos, because to your point, there's pathos in all of it, right? But it's heavy on the logos, right? It's if each of those are primary colors, it's a painting that's just blue. Well, if you can incorporate some storytelling in there, or you can, get a little animated and put a little emotion into it and provide some more of that context, then the odds of all that effort that you did over the last quarter actually landing and letting that guy look up from his email that's on his phone, what I'm saying? If you're in that kind of an organization, is just going to be higher. And you can begin to elevate out of this, two-dimensional picture that they have of you into this more three-dimensional strategic thing that can be an asset to the company to move the company at a faster rate toward the thing that they might care about, which is, again, broad brushstrokes, bottom line, profit, whatever.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I love the storytelling as a part of that, right? Because storytelling is a kind of argument.
Totally.
But it's an argument that leaves the realm of quantification, right? And begins to weave and it leans into pathos and ethos. Who is this character and how are they interacting? Still an argument, right? It's still a whole set of relations. That's what narrative is. Narrative is just an argument, how you move from one thing to another and the relationship between them. So yeah, I love that. I love the storytelling, right? I think that's a great tool to teach people, right? How to account for pathos. You know what I mean? So you can have an HR person saying, okay, for these assessments, you got to write a little story about that person.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Rather than just tell me they hit these numbers, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually an interesting angle. And I just, anytime that you're starting to incorporate that storytelling, I think like we're all kind of wired for story, but we think that there are these boundaries of like, oh, well, stories shouldn't go into this realm. This is the finance realm, and we should be talking about bottom line and numbers. Well, anybody that I've ever worked with in the finance game, they come up with what they want to do, and then they back into it with the numbers. Okay, there I said it. Okay, so we think that we're these like logical beings, that we take all these ones and zeros and inputs and and we spit out the logical answer, and we're just these like automatons, but we're not. We're the opposite of that. We're these emotional beings that happen to think. So I'm just saying that there's like tremendous opportunity in that storytelling to incorporate more of the emotionality or whatever to try to push that argument forward. Like, something that we say all the time is like, logic makes you think, emotion makes you act, right? Like if you got married and you came with a PowerPoint presentation that said, here's my earning potential and blah, 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 there's zero romance in that. So she'll take that home and she'll think about it. You know what I'm saying? If there's no emotion in it, there's no romance in it, then, you're going to have a well-informed person, a well-informed CEO who's not going to take any action. And I mean, that's not to say that like there should be no logic in it, obviously, but it needs to be a balance of both. But so many times we just think like, we just need to stick to the facts, just the facts, man.
Yep. Yeah, no, it's a funny thing. I one place I was helping sort of vet everybody's writing, right? And so I was looking at sort of presentations. It was an agency, right? And I was looking at the presentations they give, and I was like, what? Why are you using this language? Where'd you get this formality from, right? And then I was looking at their emails, and when they're writing to clients, all of a sudden they get this very formal,
dear sir or madam,
bullet points. I'm like, okay, can I look at the emails you write to your friends? And I was like, yeah, that's nice. Why don't you write like that to the client, right? I don't understand, right?
No.
Yeah. It's what my son now, he's just 17. He makes, he's a filmmaker, but he's making these short movies for, he's reaching out to brands all over the world, right? And emailing them and saying, I'll make a little ad for you on Instagram for X amount of money. And I'm helping him learn how to write the emails to these people, right?
Cool.
And I'm like, you want to find this balance. At first he's like 17 and everything was lowercase and misspelled. And I was like, no, that's too personable, right? They don't know you yet, right? So you got to build your ethos. But at the same time, it doesn't need to be this dear blah, 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 right? Like I was like, just be yourself, but they don't know you. So prove that you know how to write a sentence, that you're a reliable person. It's finding that ethos. Right. And then finding the voice he has, which has pathos in it. It's not just, I will have your film delivered by this date. Right. It's, yeah, I'm really excited to be working on this thing. I think it's coming along great. Can't wait to show it to you. I think it's super, super cool. Right. Trying to teach him just a little bit of rhythm that he has in everyday speech and put that in your business speak. We're all just people talking to people.
That's right. The guy who's running the company, the guy who's mopping the floors, they're still going home and watching the same Netflix shows. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And they still, and they, you know, they have a little indigestion from their lunch. They're in a fight with their partner. Their kids are annoying them. You know, they're a little hungover. Whatever, they're people.
Right. You know what's funny is like during the pandemic, there was this weird phase where like people were incorporating this like weird formality in all of their emails where everything started like it was like a Victorian, like, I hope you and your family are doing well, like, very well during these like tough times or something. Like, but it's like no one knew which way to go with it, because like if you didn't say anything about it, then you were just like a heartless bastard. Like, are you trying to sell when people are dying? And then you go this other side, and it felt so stilted and like bizarre. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's funny when there's this mass cultural moment, right?
Totally.
And everyone has to navigate it in their own way, you know?
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about, you know, what you're working on now, and tell me about kind of like what's next on the horizon for you.
I have two things happening, right? Which is, you know, I've had this business where I consult, but I actually have now gone in-house to a crypto company.
Oh, cool.
And I've been working with them for like 3.5 years. It's another example where I have never gone in-house, but I've doubled down completely on this company because I love the culture. It's incredibly interesting. And we're trying to solve like real problems, like global poverty, right?
Do they care about respect?
Exactly. But it's so foundational because we just started as this group of people who really respect each other. And we're now hitting that inflection point of how we scale. And we're like, okay, I think we need some HR. I think we need to figure out how we keep this culture going, right? We've gone from like 6 to 10 to 40. It's like, well, okay, what do we do? Like, how do we onboard new people? How do we get them into this mix, right? And we're just trying to figure that out. The other side is I've been writing, I've been working on this book about pleasure. I've wanted to write about pleasure for a long time. And during COVID, I really kind of had some more deep revelations. I've been alone a tremendous amount of the time.
Right.
It made me think. I've had this great opportunity just to sort of think and write. So I'm trying to write this book about pleasure called In Defense of Pleasure, that I think our culture denigrates pleasure, right? Or it gets co-opted by consumerism. Okay. Right? So you think pleasure is buying something.
Yeah.
Right. There is a pleasure there. We think pleasure is consumption. We think pleasure is this thing that happens after the fact, as opposed to pleasure being, like I say, always at hand. We have inherent pleasure. Just being in your body is a pleasurable thing. Feeling the wind on your face, right? There's pleasure always to be had, but it's been redefined by certain forces, right? Certain consumers forces, right? Certain capital forces.
Yeah, the pleasure of the steak is when you're done and you can sit back and do that, instead of like each bite of the steak being the enjoyment of it.
Yeah. Pleasure is just sort of always there, and it doesn't have to happen on the weekends. And our kind of culture, right, has been so defined by business. It's organized so much of our life, and it's taken this thing called pleasure and defined it. So we think pleasure is, again, tethered to luxury. So I can work really hard now, I'll have pleasure later, through buying things, which really serves the system quite well, right? So you work for us all day, and then on the weekends you buy our product, right? So in that model, all we ever live is in a company town, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, you're spending your check at the general store.
Exactly.
That's crazy.
So I'm trying to break that. Yeah, if you actually privilege pleasure in a culture, nobody would work 60 hours a week, right? Nobody would write on PowerPoint all day, or maybe a few people might decide that's their pleasure, but most people aren't going to do that.
Yeah, and what's interesting is about bringing that sort of beginner's mind to everything, that can kind of bring some new pleasure to what you're doing, right? You can find the pleasure in, I don't know, the pleasure in the pain, or the pleasure in whatever you're learning, or whatever, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And just looking for the pleasure. And again, not thinking the pleasure is something that's way out there that I need to go get, that I need to earn. Pleasure is always right there.
Interesting. Well, that sounds super interesting. I wanted to talk to you about one extra thing, or a number of other things, but we'll stop maybe on this one. These codes of conduct, like a lot of the difficulty that I think multinational companies get or have in the context of like trying to fight against anti-bribery, for example, or developing these codes of conduct about what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable, like, you know, right and wrong versus do the right thing or something like that. It seems to kind of break down in these different jurisdictions or these different cultures in different places around the world, where, like, you know, again, I'm not saying, you know, let's all take bribes and do bribery and so forth, but like, it was just a little while ago that like you could write off bribes in Germany. Like, this wasn't 50 years ago. You know what I'm saying? So like in some places it's a way of life. how do you help, or how do you, maybe you're not to this point yet with with the organization that like you're a part of, but these kinds of things are going to be pretty soon on the frontier of like where you're expanding to. How do you think about this sort of like multivalent world we live in that gets sort of limited to this two-dimensional document or this two-dimensional list of rules that are supposed to sort of dictate everything?
Yeah, it's a great question, man. I wish I had an answer. I think it's so, we're watching two sort of forces at work. One is the force of business, right, which doesn't really care about the nation state. They care about it only in as much as they can deploy its military force, right, to support its needs, right? So they can go get their oil back for them, or right, open up a market like in Bolivia for Tesla. But it's at some point, right? I mean, that's sort of what the blockchain is all about too, is right. So the post-nation state, these different kinds of networks. So I think what you have right now is you have these global corporations that sort of bleed, right? They're all over the place.
Yeah.
You have the nation states which sort of parse it, right? And they have these laws, right? And so I know in the US, it's super strict rules about, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
Yeah, exactly.
My brother's a lawyer in Thailand, and he helps American production companies navigate making films in Thailand so they don't break those laws.
Right.
That's what he does, so they don't just bribe the guy on the street saying, listen, can we film here? That they actually go and get the license following Thai protocol.
Right.
But I think, to be honest, I think the blockchain might be the answer, right? Because it has governance modules built into it, right?
Okay.
That's really what it is. It's a cooperative consensus protocol. It's what a blockchain is. And so I think it becomes like a nation state, right? In which you can vote and you can allocate resources and you can make rules.
Interesting.
Right? And as opposed to these corporations, which were born out of nation states, quite literally, that's what a corporation is. It's a federal tax status.
It's an entity, right? Yeah. Right.
But it's created by the federal government, right?
Yeah.
Those things a corporation until you file with the federal government.
Right.
So it sort of gives you this grant to operate, but then they're running into the sort of boundaries of the nation, right? So it's an antiquated model, right? Yeah. So I think the blockchain becomes the way it will sort of supersede this distinction between corporations and states.
Super interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I want to be, I could probably keep talking to you all day, but appreciate all your work. Appreciate you coming on. This was a lot of fun. Where can people find you? It's
funny. I've had this blog forever on Blogger, right? It's called Emphatic Oomph. And I hate bloggers so much, but I have so much work on there. I mean, it's thousands and thousands and thousands of posts. I don't know how to migrate it to something else. I need some help. If anyone wants to help me do that. So right now I've been writing on Medium, but I tell people on the Blogger to go to Medium. So yeah, it's called Emphatic Oomph. You Google me, it should come up pretty fast.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. We'll put some links in the post. And yeah, just appreciate your work and all that you've taught us today, man.
Yeah, that was super fun. I'm honored, and thank you.